Hi, my name is Glen Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we wanted to thank everyone for viewing the first in our series of interviews that we're doing as a part of our Eastern Approaches webinars. I hope that you found the first one very successful. We certainly appreciate the 4,000 plus viewers who looked and watched the episode on reconnoitering the Suwalki. We are very happy today to be able to have before us someone that is by himself, I think, a legend and a father to many of us who follow the nationalities issues and have followed the nationalities question in the Soviet Union and in the future of Russia. And I think it's really befitting that we begin our second episode with a wonderful interview with Paul Goble. Paul Goble needs no introduction to many of us. He's certainly a legend to many who have been in the field. He was present at the creation of I would say, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and when he worked at the State Department prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Paul Goble is best known to many for his blog on Eurasia that he started. I think, Paul, it was back in 2004 was when you first created that.
Correct.
But it was certainly something that reaches the inboxes of thousands of people around the world who follow your writings. And we've been long and honored that you've had an attachment, affiliation with Jamestown, and have been writing for Eurasia Daily Monitor publication for us for over a decade now. But those of you who don't know Paul, his career has been a long and distinguished career where he worked in various capacities at the State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, the International Broadcast Bureau, as well as the voice of American Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He currently is sequestered somewhere in the Shenandoah Mountains. Rumor has it that it's in Staunton, Virginia, but I think that's the best place to be these days to write. And it's a great personal pleasure to have you here today, Paul. And in our pre-discussion, you mentioned that you actually had a communication with Sir Fitzroy Maclean at one point, who coined the original book, Eastern Approaches. Would you mind telling us about how that began for you?
Well, thank you, Glenn, for having me. Yes, I'm old enough to have actually known Fitzroy Maclean. In the 1970s, he published yet another book on Inner Asia, in which he touched on events in Mongolia. And several of the things he said in the chapter on Baron Ungern in 1920-21, I didn't think were true. So I thought I should write him a letter and say that my facts are different than your facts, and let's compare notes. I remember it to this day because it was the first time that I ever had to write a letter to someone who was a knight of the British Empire. And I was fairly confident that the proper salutation was not "Dear Sir," but something else. So I went to my Emily Post and discovered that when you send a letter to a knight of the British Empire, which Maclean was, the proper way is to simply say "Sir" with an exclamation point. That's what I learned at the time. He and I corresponded then for several years thereafter. He's long in the next life, but it was a great pleasure to have known him. It is somewhat depressing to realize that our exchange of letters is now longer ago than the period between when he visited Central Asia illegally in the 1930s and wrote his classic book, Eastern Approaches.
Well, that's a wonderful story, Paul, and that certainly is befitting for what we're going to talk about today. There's many adjectives used to describe you, and one is that you did graduate from the University of Chicago, and you had an esteemed classmate where you studied under Alexander Bennigsen, the noted Soviet nationalities expert, and some of your classmates were Martha Brill Olcott and people like Anders Wimbush, who also went on to write about nationalities issues. And I think a lot of people know that your background, but you certainly have been one of the godfathers of the studies of nationalities. I'd like to ask you today to talk about your recent article in Eurasia Daily Monitor published on August 4th. You wrote a very interesting piece that was talking about Siberian regionalism as a growing threat to Moscow. And I'd like to ask you today if you could go into that article, among other things, but talk about what exactly is Siberian regionalism and how do you see it as a threat to the Russian power center in Moscow? And wasn't regionalism the path to power that Boris Yeltsin used in his path in Russia after Gorbachev? And where do you think this, you talked about regionalism replacing the role of nationalism. That was a very fascinating comment that you made. But please talk to us a little bit about your article and why you spent a lot of time and effort to giving the background on that.
Well, that's a whole bunch of questions. Let me start with the last one, which is why regionalism rather than nationalism. In many ways, before 1991, very, very few people in the West wanted to pay attention to non-Russian nations. The view was that the nationality question had been solved, after all, Moscow said it had, and that these were marginal issues. It wasn't a serious subject. Many of us who studied nationalities at Chicago were told you would be better advised to study something else because nothing will come of studying the nationalities. Now, we didn't listen, and I'm glad we didn't, but that was the attitude. Then when the Soviet Union came apart in 1991, along nationality lines with the 11 11 Soviet non-Russian republics and the 3 occupied Baltic states gaining their independence from Moscow, and the Russian Federation gaining its independence, as it were, from the Soviet Union, suddenly people decided that nationality was terribly important. I'm afraid that people overlearned what they had not been willing to admit before. Namely, they focused on nationality as the only challenge in the population to political leadership. When people talk about nationality challenges to Moscow today, they talk about the North Caucasus, they talk about the Middle Volga, they talk about the numerically small peoples of the North and the Far East. The fact is, if you consider, the Soviet or Russian figures are not accurate, but if you consider that only about a quarter of the population of the Russian Federation is non-Russian, and most of them are quite a bit smaller than the Union republics were at the end of Soviet times, whereas at the end of Soviet times, the non-Russian Union republics formed 50% of the population. So that the non-Russians as such, as a collective, are relatively smaller. But 2 thoughts. First, the Union republics reflected not only ethnic differences with the center, but also regional ones. That is to say, they had an agenda which reflected where they were, who the leaders were, and so on. Within the Russian Federation, what's now the Russian Federation, you still have serious ethnic problems, the Circassians, the Tatars, and so on. But more important, within what Mr. Putin believes is a unified Russian nation, there are important regional interests. Please remember that Vladivostok is closer to San Francisco than it is to Moscow. It's a very big country, and the Russian Far East is very far away and not very well integrated or connected. And it's generally been treated rather badly by the center. Standard of living in the Far East is much lower than in European Russia, and so on. But that's a reason why you would expect regionalism to emerge. But why Siberian regionalism? Why is it so important? Well, I think there are 3 reasons. First, the people of Siberia are much more like the people of the American West. They're explorers. Some of them are criminals who fled European Russia because they were trying to escape punishment, or they were people sent there to be punished. They're much more entrepreneurial. They're much more independent-minded. They're much less willing to obey than the people in European Russia. Many people have observed, and I pointed out in my article, that in European Russia, you have the tradition of serfdom, a kind of slavery that existed until the middle of the 19th century. There was never serfdom in Siberia. These were people who were independent small farmers, independent small entrepreneurs. It's a different group of people, and that difference means that when people in Siberia are mobilized, they're mobilized in the direction of greater autonomy, greater personal responsibility. They don't want to be told what to do, and they're not willing to obey in anywhere close to the same way that is true in the European portion of the Russian Federation. The second point is that Siberians, being more independent-minded, have a very different culture. It's not just that they weren't serfs. If you look at the statistics, Siberians, the most important religious denominations in Siberia are Protestant Christians, not the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its Caesaro-Papist tradition, has held the Russian people into a vice, but only in European Russia. In Siberia and the Far East, most Russians who are religious at all, and they're less religious on average than is true of the country as a whole, most of them are Protestants, Presbyterians, Methodists, Christian Zionists, whatever you want. And that too leads them to be to have a very different view. And the third thing is this: Mr. Putin has created his own nemesis in Siberia, much as he has created his own nemesis elsewhere. Moscow, for 100 years, has assumed that the reason it doesn't have to worry about Siberian regionalism, which was very important in the middle and late 19th century and at the time of the Russian Civil War, is that Moscow can always play up the Chinese threat. No, you live in Siberia, but if we don't protect you, the Chinese will come and occupy you. And that was the ideological message that was delivered by every Soviet and Russian leader until Mr. Putin. Putin made the mistake of deciding to make money off the Chinese, to rent land, to sell territory to Chinese firms, to allow for the immigration of Chinese. And so right now, if you're a Siberian, you're probably as angry at Moscow as you are at Beijing. And if Moscow tries to say Moscow will protect you against China, the response is, no, Moscow is selling us out to the Chinese. So the consequence is Russians in the Far East look to China as an economic success story, and they look to Moscow as having betrayed their area. So there is a large reservoir of anti-Moscow sentiment that has a history going back to the creation of Russian Siberian Far East, going back 3 or 4 centuries, that is affected by the rise of Protestantism and much more independent-mindedness in the region, and by this failure of Moscow to keep the Chinese out, but rather invite them in for the fun and profit of the Kremlin. One of the things that one remembers if one watched the end of the Soviet Union is something that I regret to say almost all analysts have forgotten. When the Soviet Union was careening out of stability in the mid-1980s, the first mass protests did not happen in Moscow. The very first nationalist protest after Gorbachev came to power was in Sakha, Yakutia. In April of 1986, the first mass protest in the whole USSR took place in Yakutsk, where Sakha people went out with the slogan, Yakutia for the Yakuts. The next mass protest, and this is instructive too, was in December of 1986 in Almaty. How did that happen? Because Gorbachev replaced a popular ethnic Kazakh with a Russian outsider, leading to demonstrations and riots that cost 200 lives. If you want to look at where we are now, what you see is we've had both of those kinds of demonstrations already. First, ones where people are saying our territory for ourselves, the Nenets, and you're seeing people in Krasnoyarsk saying, you don't take away our popular leader and insert an outsider to rule us. There is a direct parallel between what is happening now. Moscow demonstrations, the first large Moscow demonstration in Gorbachev's time, does not happen until the end of 1989, 3 years later. People have forgotten that because most people focus on Moscow as if the sun rises and sets on the ring road, when in fact, Russia is a very large country. Moscow is not everything. And the demonstrations will come to Moscow, but they are coming in the periphery first. People have ignored the fact, and I think the Eurasia Daily Monitor is to be praised because we've attracted a lot of these. There have been demonstrations in Sakha. There have been demonstrations in the Donetsk Autonomous District. There have been demonstrations in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan in the non-Russian areas, but there have also been demonstrations in Murmansk, a predominantly Russian area, and now there are demonstrations in Krasnoyarsk and other predominantly Russian cities in the Far East, which are now feeding on this historical difference from Moscow, the populist agenda against the center. And that's what ultimately tore the Soviet Union apart. And my argument in the piece yesterday on the 4th was that regionalism is now going to play much the same role that nationalism played at the end of Soviet times. It's going to create a problem that the center can't easily respond to, because almost anything the center does will make the situation worse. If it cracks down, it will create martyrs. That won't work. If it makes concessions, there will be more demands.
So where do you see the kind of, you painted a very interesting strategic picture of the regionalism starting in Khabarovsk and then kind of filtering its way to other parts of Russia. But where do you see kind of the demonstration in Khabarovsk going? You've seen the reports that it's still raining there. There's very bad weather. The demonstrations are continuing. How do you see Putin, this kind of playing out, and with Putin vis-a-vis the authorities in Khabarovsk over this time?
I think Putin understands that cracking down would be disastrous because it would be like throwing water at a grease fire, as we used to say of Gorbachev. Gorbachev was never willing to really crack down, because had he really cracked down, the situation would have gotten out of control even faster. What I think Putin is counting on is that ultimately people will get tired and they'll go away. I think that would be true. But there's one fly in that ointment, and that's this. There are regional elections scheduled for early September. The people of Krasnoyarsk are going to stay in the street at least through those. And because they do, other regions will take heart and will vote against Moscow's candidates. And I think Putin is wrong. I think he's miscalculated. I think that the United Russia pro-Putin party is going to suffer major losses in September. And when it does in the gubernatorial elections, I think what you will see is a gradual shifting away from Putin by members of the central elite. And I think you'll begin to see people in Moscow and in the Russian cities of European Russia going into the streets as well, because they too have a regional agenda. It just is different than the regional agenda in Siberia or the regional agenda in the north.
So it's basically one where people are being emboldened. They can see that you can stand up to Putin and resist and actually survive.
That's right.
And you're going to see kind of a spin-off effect of that to other parts of the country, because you still have other nationalities inside of Russia, not as many as you did in, say, 1991, but certainly there's enough of concern that I wouldn't say it's a perfect timing of everything, but you could be, as you say, as it did with Gorbachev in '89, it could be just a process of these demonstrations kind of picking up momentum and forming some type of opposition to Putin, and allows other people to enter in the scene in the same way that Boris Yeltsin did.
Well, what happened in 87, 88, 89 was that Russians around Gorbachev saw that that the population was pushing for certain things, and that encouraged them to push. It also led to people resist. And we saw the resistance surface in August of 91 in the attempted coup. I would suggest that we are likely to see repetitions of that too. In other words, there will be people who will complain that Putin isn't doing enough. He isn't cracking down hard enough. There is that what you will see is, I think, a fractionation of the regime, divided between people who want to do more and people who want to make concessions, and that conflict too will have the effect of weakening the regime, because it will be seen. We saw that happen in 88, 89, 90, 91 in the USSR, and I see no reason to think that we won't see something parallel that. That does not mean that we're about to see a liberal, democratic, free market Russia emerge. It may very well mean that this time around the coup people win, at least in the short term, that we may see something even worse than the Putin regime, even more openly fascist than he is. And that's a risk. The assumption, however, that Putin is good for another 16 years per the constitutional amendment is, I think, misplaced, to put it mildly. I think that, yes, he has the right under this amended constitution to run again, but I don't think he's going to be given the chance. And I think that the developments in Russia in the next five years are going to be far rougher and far more up and down than people want. And I believe that in that process, it will be Russian regions, Siberia first and foremost, but also other Russian regions, the north, and non-Russian groups, especially those that are dispersed, like the Tatars and the Circassians.
Well, in your article, you talked about, and you mentioned this previously, about Moscow has long assumed it can count on Russian fears of Chinese expansionism to keep the Siberians in line. Now, let's talk about China here. I mean, where's China in all this? I mean, the China on Russia's border today economically is much different than the China that existed in 1991. So, and as you point out, many Siberians see China as an economic success story. So I want to use this opportunity to kind of talk about the changing perspectives about China by Russians in the Far East, but also I want to kind of segue into the Palmers if we can, and writing on that. But where do you see China in all this?
Well, I think that on the one hand, most people along the border of China in the Russian Far East, and please remember that the Russian Far East, in terms of population, is much like Canada. Just as 80% of Canadians live within 150 miles of the border with the US, something like 90% of the people in Siberia and the Russian Far East live within 150 miles of a foreign border, mostly China, but also Mongolia. So they look at this as an economic success story. What the people in the Far East do not like is the fact that Vladimir Putin has opened up the market inside Russia to Chinese firms, has given them preferential treatment, has allowed them to have a virtual extraterritorial legal status, often crowding out local Siberian firms. People don't like that. And it's not like this is stopped with what's happening in Krasnoyarsk. Last week, Vladimir Putin signed another law that will allow the Chinese to develop territory right along Lake Baikal, possibly further contaminating it, which is an ecological issue that's a political issue for Russians. It's making people angry. I think there are two. I am one of those who doesn't think the Chinese in the near term are interested in occupying all of Siberia. I think they expect over time that the people along the border will look to China. They will be a neo-colony rather than a real colony of the Chinese. And they're more careful about their involvement in Siberia than Vladimir Putin is. Putin has been a cheerleader for things that a lot of Chinese have been careful to avoid. China is many things. It's a economic powerhouse of sorts. It's got its own internal problems. I'm not a China specialist, but it has a huge ethnic problem that is another issue. And my personal view, as an obiter dicta here, is that the West has failed utterly to understand the ethnic problem in China, and should be thinking about that as a restraining force. But that's a different issue here. But China is also a rising military power. And Russia's relationship with China is complicated because of its relationship with us. Russia doesn't want to be China's junior partner, and China isn't going to allow Russia to be anything but. And China, I think, will use its military power less directly north than it will towards Central Asia, where I think it believes it can pick up a lot of pieces. I think China is more careful, and I think because it has a longer time horizon. I suspect Henry Kissinger's story that Zhou Enlai said it was too soon to tell what the impact of the French Revolution was is totally apocryphal and made up. But it's true in another sense, and that is the Chinese have a different time horizon than we do. The Chinese look at a world, they can imagine that they will have much of this region drop into their laps just because of the distances, just because of the location. I mean, people don't seem to understand that there's a single rail line between European Russia and the Russian Far East. There is no four-lane highway. Several years ago, Vladimir Putin opened what was supposedly the first trans-Russia highway from Vladivostok to St. Petersburg. 7,000 plus miles long. It was going to be this great achievement. Western newspapers fell all over themselves to say how wonderful it was. Well, I would have thought it was a whole lot more wonderful if I hadn't known several facts. The first is that of that 7,000 plus miles, only 150 miles had more than 2 lanes. This is not an interstate highway. Second, I would have been more impressed if I hadn't known that over half of it wasn't paved. And I third would have been even more impressed if I hadn't known that there were no bridges or even any way to get across, any barge traffic, any ferry traffic to get across 8 major rivers in Siberia and the Far East. It was a nice PR move by Vladimir Putin. It just didn't happen to be true, as anyone who'd bother look. The Russian Far East is not well connected with the rest of Russia in terms of transportation network. Its people, the most interesting intellectuals who think about the Siberia and the Far East, believe that their future is to be the United States of Siberia, allied with the Pacific Rim countries of South Korea, China, Japan, and the United States, and make its way in the world by playing off these different groups. Whether that happens, we'll see. But that's what people are saying. The Chinese in the short term aren't looking militarily north. They see it as a source of raw materials, and Putin's only too willing to sell them: coal, oil, gas, iron. But that's not, he's handling it in a way that's costing him support of his own population.
Yeah, I find that interesting that, most of the great powers that have harbored pretensions against Russia, or you could say that, most of the great powers have risen on our borders, have always looked at Russia as sort of this raw materials appendage. and mostly as kind of a transit route between different parts of Europe and Eurasia. And I think that's it's a pity now that Russia economically is not able to support these areas. And that kind of brings to the question of what you wrote about in your EDM article on July 30th. You wrote a very interesting article about entitled "Beijing Implies Tajikistan's Pamir region should be returned to China." And this article you wrote was based upon Chinese historian who wrote about the entire Pamir region used to belong to China at one time. And the article went in to talk about the geopolitics of Tajikistan and the geopolitical balance of power in this part of Eurasia. So talk a little bit about where the Pamirs you see, where this fitting into this geopolitical struggle, especially as the U.S. is getting positioned to withdraw from Afghanistan. What do you see happening in the Pamirs?
Well, I'd like to make two preliminary comments on that because it's appropriate that we're doing something with Fitzroy Maclean. As he made clear in his book, in Central Asia, you don't have borders, you have frontiers. They're zones, they're not lines. And if you look back in time, who's been in control has varied, and it's usually been contested. So the idea that this area was definitively part of China or definitively not part of China is exactly what isn't the case in that part of the world. And so that makes people worried when anyone like this Chinese historian, Chu, suggests that it used to belong to us because it implies it should belong to us again. Second, the Chinese do see a need to control the Pamirs because it's a way of making sure that the Islamist groups in Afghanistan and further into the Middle East don't get to Xinjiang, the restive Muslim majority, still Muslim majority region of much of Xinjiang is Muslim majority still, and where the Chinese are engaged in what can only be described as a genocidal crackdown on that population. It wants to make sure it controls passage through that area. And so that's a security consideration. If having access to wood and coal in Siberia is one set of issues, making sure that your country isn't invaded by Islamist radicals who will lead to another revolt in Kashgar, which Maclean talks about in his book, is something that the military and the security people in Beijing are going to be very concerned about. And over the last 20 years, what we've seen is China has dramatically expanded its military and security presence on what is currently the Chinese side of the border. And it has been busily working with the Tajiks, offering them, quote, security assistance, which, as any number of Tajik writers have pointed out, it looks like they're building for themselves rather than for us. And I think that's true. I think the Chinese view controlling the Pamir, controlling the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan, which adjoins the Pamir Mountains, is something that is critical to their national security. And they have the military power in that region that no other outside power at this point is going to be able to contest. If China wants to take the Pamirs or to take the Wakhan, it probably can do so without many people resisting very much. What it will do, I suspect, however, is not occupy and redraw the line on the map, but put its forces in there so that it controls the situation, even though the line on the map has not yet been redrawn, and that redrawing will happen only sometime in the future.
Where do you, I think one of the things that your article highlighted about is the Russians have a very touchy nerve about Tajikistan and the Pamirs. I mean, they certainly still view it as a part of their sphere of influence. And that article really kind of went into kind of the Russian tendencies to kind of exaggerate Chinese interests, but to kind of really portray them as being neo-imperial in this area. Do you think that's just Russians being kind of themselves, or is this really, you think, something deeper?
Well, I think the Russians. I think that many people around Putin and in the Russian government believe that the loss in Afghanistan, or the withdrawal in Afghanistan, not the loss, but their view, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, was the beginning of the end. And therefore, they paid a great deal more attention to northern Afghanistan than we have, a great deal more attention to the Pamirs and the Wakhan than we have, and that any third party coming in represents a threat to them. And there are people in Moscow who are not prepared to be a junior partner to the Chinese. And therefore, if they can play up what many Russians would see as a threat to Russian security, maybe they can slow down the process of Russian-Chinese rapprochement, because I think it's fair comment that no one can imagine Chinese willing anymore to be the junior partner in such an alliance. And if you don't want to be the junior partner as a Russian, what you do is to point to things the Chinese are doing that call into question its commitment to Russian national interests.
I think, a point in your article where you said that China was building as many as 30 different plans to build 30 different airfields in that region, and Tashkurgan airfield was just the beginning of 30. It certainly kind of portrays the Chinese intentions are much larger than that. And I think that you're spot on to be focusing on, the infrastructure developments, because that really portrays and sends a signal really where Chinese intentions are kind of directed.
One way to look at that is in the next 2 or 3 years, China will have perhaps 2 orders of magnitude longer aircraft landed than the Russians do in the same place. They can put a lot more planes and therefore a lot more men into that area than the Russians can. And once that dominance becomes as evident as I think it already is heading toward, Russia will not be able to risk doing anything. And so the Chinese will win by default. If you can build 30 airports, you are going to be able to put an awful lot of power, project an awful lot of power very, very fast. It is worrisome to me that people are not paying attention to just how much resources China is putting in to projecting power into the edge of Central Asia, and especially into Tajikistan and northern Afghanistan. We still are looking at it as a Russian-American great game. No, there's a new player in the great game in town, and guess what? It may very well be that the old players are going to be pushed aside, just as the British were ultimately pushed aside after 1956.
And the only way Russia economically cannot counter that, really, I mean, it still has influence there, as in the way that the British had influence in India, but still in Central Asia, Russia doesn't have that economic power, so it has to resort to playing kind of a spoiler role in Afghanistan, like it appears to be positioning itself with its contacts with the Taliban. I mean, do you see keeping that contact with the Taliban as a way to kind of keep an eye on and use them in a way in a post-U.S. Afghanistan against the Chinese?
Well, I think that the Russians are playing a weak hand, and their weak hand is to form alliances with people like the Taliban, to use them against Russia's geopolitical opponents. They're clearly using the Taliban against the United States. And I'm sure that there are people in Moscow who are thinking, maybe we can use these people against China. The problem is that the reason the Chinese are in the Pamirs And the reason they're building infrastructure in Western China of this military kind is precisely because the Chinese are worried about that kind of activity. And so if the Chinese conclude that Russia is trying to redirect the Taliban against them, that will be the end of any kind of Chinese cooperation with the Russians. And the Russians will find themselves left out in the cold because the Chinese care first and foremost about security and respect. And that kind of behavior, I think, would blow up in Moscow's face. And I think the Russians know that too.
Yeah, and I think too, they also know that the Pakistanis will be deeply involved in supporting the Taliban, and that the China-Pakistan relationship is certainly the cards in the deck are being stacked against Moscow in a post-Afghanistan, a post-U.S. Afghanistan, and that's the part that I find so fascinating, because the great game will be kind of put in reverse, so the shoe will be on the other foot. Because the Russians will be in this position of trying to make up for that. And it was interesting in the article, you read another article on EDM about Russian military presence in Central Asia. And it was interesting that how you talked about the military expansion of Russia's footprint at Kant Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. You were quoting a Russian author by the name of Pogrebnyak, who was writing about that. And because the Russians still are quite, you were saying that the Russian military presence in Kant Air Base now is more about China than it is about the U.S. because we're no longer there with a military foothold in Kyrgyzstan. So, I mean, that's also, Kyrgyzstan is also kind of becoming a swing player here in Central Asia.
Well, the Kant base was ours until we managed to mishandle things, and now it's Russia's again. And the Russians are looking at that not vis-a-vis us, not even vis-a-vis Afghanistan. They're looking because China has been moving into Kyrgyzstan more than any other republic in Central Asia, except Tajikistan. The Tajiks are the most dependent on the Chinese, but the Kyrgyz are not far behind. The big difference is that so far, the Tajiks have not become anti-Chinese as a population the way the Kyrgyz have. There have been anti-Chinese riots in Bishkek where Chinese stores have been burned and Chinese have been attacked. There's a lot of anger against the Chinese in Kyrgyzstan, not least of all because there are a lot of ethnic Kyrgyz in Chinese re-education camps. So China has a complicated role. It can't do everything it would like to do either. It has a lot of baggage, but clearly there is a new great game, and the players are a little different. And the people who were on offense in the past are now on the defensive.
A former professor of mine who was a historian of the Great Game said that the Great Game will still be played only when there's no one else standing. And so as long as there's still someone standing, we're going to have to deal with that. I want to move to the Caucasus for a brief moment and shift our attention to your writings about the Caucasus. And can you just talk a little bit about the recent fighting that has occurred in Tovuz region of northern Azerbaijan on the border with Armenia? And where do you see the South Caucasus going?
That's a big question too. I think let me address where I think the fighting is going. My guess is that all kinds of people are going to look for ways to back off from escalation, that the escalation is just too dangerous. An independent Russian military analyst, Felgengauer, has warned that the Russians will use nuclear weapons if they have to save Armenia. And I don't think that's trivial. I don't think that's a trivial threat, because he makes clear that they wouldn't use them on population points initially, but they would use them as a demonstration effect to show they were prepared to do that. If Russia doesn't provide that kind of ultimate guarantee to the Armenians, Russia won't retain the influence in Armenia it needs to use Armenia as a major weapon in the South Caucasus. A very, very wise Azerbaijani commentator once said that in the South Caucasus, Georgia is the way, Armenia is the tool, and Azerbaijan is the prize. Moscow would love to have Baku change sides, to have Baku become a pro-Russian outpost. And if Baku were ever willing to do that, it would find that Moscow would give up on the Armenians in 24 hours. And I think the Armenians know that. I'm even somewhat persuaded that the current round of violence happened because some people in Yerevan were trying to test to make sure that the Russians would still come out on their side, would still protect them against an Azerbaijani move. And it was a provocation. And I think that the Azeris have reacted as one would expect. More frighteningly, the Turks, because of their involvement in Nakhchivan, which is another area that people don't pay enough attention to geopolitically, excuse me, are going to, that carries with it the risk of a serious escalation. I think the Russians are not happy with the Armenians. I think they'd like to have a deal with Baku. I don't think they can get one. I think the Azeris are pursuing an honest-to-God multivariant foreign policy. There have been moves recently to improve relations with Tehran, which is Moscow had always assumed you could play the Iranian card against Azerbaijan, just like you could play the Chinese card against the Siberians. That's no longer as true as it once was. I think the rise of Turkey puts Russia in a different position. A really close to Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance creates all kinds of problems for Russia that wants to project power north-south. We talk almost exclusively east-west, but for Russia, the north-south axis is equally significant. So my guess is in the short term, this upsurge of violence will gradually calm down. There will be conversations. And I think the Russians have decided that in the current circumstances, that's the least bad option for them. And I think that's why they've taken they've had the position of neutrality, that, please stop fighting.
And they've also seen the demonstrations in Moscow and the conflict burst open into the streets of Moscow between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and that makes them very uncomfortable as well.
And not just in Moscow, but in St. Petersburg, in a bunch of cities in the Urals. The FSB has taken day-to-day control over 3 regions in the Urals Mountains because there are so many Azerbaijanis and Armenians there that they're convinced that the political authorities would lose control unless the FSB is there to knock heads. That's a huge problem. War has come home to Russia, and so they want it to go away. What's interesting is that provides a lever that both Baku and Yerevan may consider using in the future, although it's a very, very dangerous one.
But it's a given fact that Pashinyan is certainly not Moscow's candidate. So they're kind of caught between the old Armenian Guard with Kocharyan and the others, and then you have Pashinyan come to power, who's someone who kind of represents the George Soros type of greatest fear of the Russians. That's someone they couldn't control, but yet again, somebody that was not their pick was able to, in the most recent fighting, be quite cleverly use these attacks in a way to taunt Azerbaijan, it seemed. And almost it's in many ways, Azerbaijan is not the Azerbaijan that you had of 20 years ago. I mean, it's now built a modern army and military, and is somewhat, and wouldn't you say, restrained in this most recent bout of fighting?
Well, I would agree with that. And if I were asked to write a chapeau or umbrella article on the South Caucasus, I think my title would include a Russian retreat in it. I think we're watching Russia lose a lot of places. We're not necessarily taking advantage of that because we don't think, at least as a government, we don't think in those terms right now. But the fact is, the Russians don't have a lot of good choices, and the people who are the periphery is changing very rapidly and away from the way Moscow wants. I believe that the last 5 years have been a period when Russia's behavior in Ukraine has had the effect of alienating almost the entire periphery. And I think we're going to see a generational shift of which Pashinyan is a part, which will want, because there's not a lot of choice, reasonable relations with Russia, but not subordinate relations to Russia. And the big challenge of the next 5 years is going to be whether Moscow can tolerate a set of bilateral and multilateral relations, which are not based on subordination of others to Russia, but rather cooperation. That's going to be almost impossible for someone like Vladimir Putin to accept. It may be, however, given Russia's other problems, especially in the economy, the only choice that a post-Putin leadership will be able to find.
I think I think that's a very accurate observation, Paul. I would agree with you that in many ways, I think they are in a retreat from the region. They're still there, no doubt, and they're still trying to foment certain aspects to retain their policy there. But I certainly think the Armenia situation has been one that's quite interesting, and I can't help but think that officials in Baku probably also see Pashinyan. In fact, I've talked to some officials that do think that Pashinyan is a better is an option that certainly is better to have someone in Armenia that's not dancing to the tune of Moscow, unlike the previous presidents in Armenia. And I think that's an aspect that, combined with new role of Turkey resurgent in the region, that I think that it's just that the strategic environment is really changing and is in a flux. I think there's still some aspects of the old system still in place, but
it may very well be time to write something up which does a balance sheet, that which has changed and that which hasn't changed. There are things that are not going to change, but there are other things that have changed quite remarkably. And it's a mistake to focus only on one or the other. I certainly believe that there are people in Baku who think that they can ultimately cut a deal with a Pashinyan that they could never have cut with someone who was Moscow's tool, because Armenia has interests which are not identical to Russia's interests. Pashinyan, I think, understands that, and I think that that's one way you appeal to him to resolve the bilateral conflict in a way that Armenia benefits too. The key thing that I think is forgotten, and I wrote about this now 30 years ago to my eternal damnation, I'm afraid, what you need in the Karabakh issue is not an armistice but a peace. Both sides have to walk away feeling they got something they wanted. The idea that we go back to a status quo ante is at best an armistice. It's not a reflection of current realities. And so the question is, can clever diplomats and politicians in these two capitals come up with some kind of arrangement where both, when the agreement ending the conflict is signed, there will be celebrations in both Yerevan and Baku. That's no easy thing to achieve, but it's not impossible either. And I think that the most important lesson, I think, of the current violence, the outburst of violence, is going to be that going in any other direction is a dead end, first and foremost for Armenia. but also creates real problems for Azerbaijan and Turkey as well. And so I'm hopeful that we may go back to something close to Key West, where there was where we were very close to a solution, and it was unfortunate that Key West didn't succeed. But the fact that it didn't succeed doesn't mean that that route can't be revisited and can't be used as a model for the future.
Paul, I completely agree, and I was thinking of Key West when you were talking, and the fact that I was talking to some colleagues in Baku a couple of weeks ago, and they were right about the time of the fighting, and they were assuring me that Azerbaijan would respond militarily against the attacks in Tavuz. And what's been noticeable is that they haven't responded militarily in any significant way, not like they did in 2016 in Nakhchivan. So that being said, the question would be why? Why would they be somewhat restrained? And I think the answer is in exactly what you're alluding to, is that they do think maybe at the end of the day that the government under Pashinyan is someone they might be able to make a deal with. But I'm not sure, but we'll see.
Right, there's a chance. That doesn't mean it will be realized. It seems to me that the key indicator of where we're going is what happens in Nakhchivan. Unless the Azerbaijanis make use of Nakhchivan to head north and cut off the Armenian forces in occupation of Azerbaijani territory, I don't think you're going to see a wider war. If the Azerbaijanis decide that they have no choice but to do that, or if they are encouraged to do that by Turkey, then a wider war is possible with some very dangerous possibilities. But right now, I think people in Baku are looking at what's happened and seeing that the Armenians may have overplayed their hand, and that now is the time to begin to think about a return to Key West, at least as a halfway house to getting a peace.
I think you're I'm in full agreement with you, Paul, and I rarely disagree with you. So I will give, we're going to wrap up the end of the program here. I'm going to give you the final word, but we thank you for taking the time to appear with us in what we hope will be the one of many future conversations on Eastern approaches. But I will give you the final word.
Thanks, Glenn. Let me end by just saying that it's always important to remember the past, but not remain its prisoner. It's important to recognize about the importance of ethnicity, which people denied for so long, but it's also important to look at other factors. And right now, in my mind, as I tried to argue in the article this week, regionalism really is the nationalism of the looming Russian Revolution.
Thank you. I think you're spot on. So, Paul, we thank you for appearing. We wish you success, and we hope to see you again. And we thank all the people who tuned in today to watch this, to keep watching our programs, and we hope to see you back again. So thanks again, Paul. Happy trails.
Thanks, Glenn. Take care.
Keep moving, moving, moving. Oh, they're disapproving. Keep them doggy